The scripture reading this morning is going to be 1 Corinthians 6, verses 17 through 20. But he who is joined to the Lord becomes one spirit with him. Flee from sexual immorality. Every other sin a person commits is outside the body, but the sexual immoral person sins against his own body. Or do you not know that your body is a temple of the Holy Spirit within you, whom you have from God? You are not your own, for you were bought with a price. So glorify God in your body.
Well, now I get to say good morning. Good morning to everybody. I'm glad that you're here, and I'm glad we get to be together. I'm glad we get to spend this time in study of God's Word. Whether you are a guest or a member with us today, we're glad that you decided to come. I started thinking, because of Phil Robertson's teachings for us a couple weeks ago, him and his wife Cheryl, that it would be good for us to talk a little bit more as a church family about God's wisdom for families. And so we're going to do a little bit in the coming few months here to cover some specific topics within that stream of ideas. I'd like to talk about marriage, as you can see from the title today. And in that, I have a couple of lessons roughly planned out for us to talk about some of the divine laws for marriage and some of the divine advice for it. But then I'd also like to kind of branch out and maybe do a few of the topics that we expect with a family series and maybe a few that we don't. I want to talk about the responsibility of fathers to disciple our kids. We'll do that, if the Lord wills, 2 weeks from today, because that's Father's Day. And if you didn't know that, now you can start shopping for your dad's new tie. But then I want to also talk about the Holy Spirit's wisdom for single adults. And I'd like to talk at some point, have a lesson titled Praying for Your Prodigal, to address what it's like for those whose children are spiritually in a far country and wasting the Father's gifts. So at the very least, I have those messages planned out for us to talk about some family things in the coming months. But today, in particular, we're going to cover some ground when it comes to marriage and family that I think is totally expected. I don't think there's any surprises to it, and with very good reason that it would be totally expected. Normally when I'm introducing a message, as you know, I try to sort of set an emotional tone for where we're going. Today, it's kind of a serious topic, and I'm not really going to waste much time with the introduction, although I don't think that's normally a waste of time. Today, I'm just not going to do it. I want us to get into a subject that is a little bit heavy, and so we're just going to open our Bibles and do a little bit of study on that subject. If you have a Bible this morning, I'd love for you to open it to Proverbs 5. Proverbs 5, and what we're going to talk about today is sexual fidelity and marriage. Now, Proverbs has the unique literary feature in the Bible of being addressed some 23 times to my son. That's one of the phrases that gets used over and over and over again as the Proverbs writer introduces a new thought or a new paragraph. He says, "My son, listen to this wisdom." And it's a literary feature, but I think it's meant to be taken as a theological feature as well, because the wisdom that is found here is so often applicable to men. And since it's done that way in the book of Proverbs, our entire message this morning is going to sort of feel like it's bent toward talking to the men, and that's because it is. Christian men have a non-negotiable responsibility to keep ourselves from sexual immorality. And Proverbs 5 is going to teach us that today as it breaks down into four main ideas. So here they are. You can fill them in, and then we'll go back and unpack each one. Verses 1 and 2 of Proverbs 5 gives us the wisdom. Verses 3 through 14 give us the warning. Verses 15 through 20 give us the way that it should be done. And verses 21, 22, and 23 give us the why behind all of it. The wisdom, the warning, the way, and the why. Let's kind of take a look at this chapter and see how all of that comes into the light. Now, let's begin by just understanding that when we go to the book of Proverbs, we are going to a wisdom book. And Proverbs is a unique book among the wisdom literature because it is meant to make us wise, but it is also presuming the fact that we are already a little bit wise, at least enough to pay attention. You know the phrase, a word to the wise, right? Well, interestingly enough, if we really backed it out, we would think that phrase would actually say a word from the wise. But it is a word to the wise because it takes some wisdom to gain more wisdom. And that's what this book does as well. This is not just a book of ancient manners, like an etiquette manual for Israelite culture. What it does is offer us a key to life. And the examples of behavior that it holds up for us to view are assessed by exactly one criteria. Is this thing foolish or is it wise? Everything that we're going to consider in the book of Proverbs, the question is simply that. Is this wisdom or is it folly? And whether you are a king in a palace or the lowliest hired hand on the ranch, there's wisdom here for you. And so when it comes to talking to men about our sexual behaviors, this is wisdom for all men, which is why the chapter begins with this appeal. My son, be attentive to my wisdom. Incline your ear to my understanding, that you may keep discretion and your lips may guard knowledge. Now let's just be honest about the book of Proverbs and let's be honest about today's message. This is not high-level atom-splitting theology today, okay? We are not going deep into the recesses of all the questions that have plagued thinkers for all of time. What we're doing today is asking and answering this question. Do you want to be more than a spiritual idiot? Then listen well. That's what this is doing. Get ready to take responsibility for who you are and for how you think, and listen to the wisdom from God. And here's the first bit of that wisdom that all of us need to think about, and that is a warning about how we behave ourselves when it comes to sexual behavior. Can I start reading in verse 3, and we're going to read this entire section down to verse 14. The lips of a forbidden woman drip honey, and her speech is smoother than oil, but in the end, she is bitter as wormwood, sharp as a two-edged sword. Her feet go down to death, her steps follow the path to the grave. She does not ponder the path of life, her ways wander, and she does not even know it. And now, O sons, listen to me, and do not depart from the words of my mouth. Keep your way far from her, and do not go near the door of her house, lest you give your honor to others, and your years to the merciless, and strangers take their fill of your strength, and your labors go to the house of a foreigner, and at the end of your life you groan when your flesh and body are consumed, and you say, how I hated discipline, and my heart despised reproof. I did not listen to the voice of my teachers, or incline my ear to my instructors. I am at the brink of utter ruin in the assembled congregation. Now, I think the warnings of these verses may not immediately sound like the most dangerous thing in the world, but with a little bit of meditation, you realize the depths of the point that the wise writer is making here. Put simply, the point is this: sex belongs in one place and one place only. It's in the bed shared between a wife and a husband. And that's it. Because in any other context, it is a dangerous and deadly poison, one that brings so much long misery to the one who drinks it. And that's the warning in this chapter. It is to warn all of us, don't choose sexual immorality, and you won't have to face the difficulties and the misery that come from it. And that's a lesson that just doesn't work for the fool, the one that's described all the way through here as he won't listen, he won't learn, he won't let it take root in his heart and in his mind. That lesson just doesn't work for him. But it does for the wise. Because what a man sacrifices to the seductress doesn't sound so bad to the immature or to the idiot. But it does sound bad to those who have the wisdom to think long term. To the one who has the wisdom to realize the value of things like honor and strength and reward for labor and the God-given joys of faithfulness, if you don't think long-term, then it doesn't sound that bad to lose all of those things. Until you're old and you have none of those things anymore, and then the regret sets in. And you see this in the text. You see this kind of regret take hold. Look at verse 12 as he bemoans his state in his old age. And he says, I hated discipline. My heart despised reproof. I didn't listen. I didn't incline my ear. And now I am ruined. You see this sad outcome, by the way, play out very literally. I think I've told you this story before, but I was blessed a handful of years ago to take a mission trip and go to one of the Caribbean islands where morality is just not nearly as commonly held in the culture as it is here. And I was standing in line at the checkout or at the check-in desk for the hotel we were staying in. And I just noticed off to the side, they had a small little bookshelf available for patrons of the hotel. You could just kind of grab a book and return it on the honor system and all of that. And so I was just kind of perusing, noticing what books were there. This is an English-speaking country, so I at least could recognize the titles. That was nice. But the one that stood out to me was a book whose title was Fathers or Breeders? The Crisis of Fatherhood in the Caribbean. And over the course of that 2 weeks or so that I spent there, I learned more and more how thoroughgoing that crisis of fatherhood had actually become. Because in the Caribbean, they have a unique situation when it comes to old age. They have nursing homes that are full of old men and almost no old women. And the reason for that is extremely simple and very telling. It is the fact that they have not been father figures, and they have certainly not been husband figures. And so when they get to the end of their lives, there's no one left to take care of them. And they all fall on government responsibility, and they all end their days sad and lonely, without even the memories of those who loved them, because there was no one who loved them. Now that kind of wisdom takes a bit of doing to see it on the front end of life. It takes a bit of wisdom to see beyond the desires of the moment and the pleasures that sin promises, and to view all the way down to the end of that timeline and to go, I don't want that. It takes a bit of wisdom to see beyond that. But if you think of it like an investment, it's kind of like an investment that you don't often realize what you're losing by not investing in good things until life catches up with you and you've spent everything on pleasures and you're left with nothing. Investing in godly marriage and in self-control and in God's proper sexual ethic is one of those things that will help us in the long run if we have the wisdom to hear it and believe it. By the way, I do think it's really interesting to take special notice of verse 9. The New American Standard Bible has it that you will give your vigor to others and your years to the cruel one. In another version, that word is vitality. Both of those ring with the idea of manliness and masculinity. And you still want to have that when you hit old age. You want to be vigorous and still have some ability to learn and to continue to try new things and to grow and to still be strong for those who need you. But the warning from the Proverbs is if you give in to sexual immorality, you choose to give up all of that. Long in advance, you choose to give up all of that. And so a godly marriage is an investment because throwing it away and all that it can offer is going to really cost in the long run. This is a bit of a preacher story, okay, but I know where this one actually came from, so that makes it not a preacher story. And if you don't know what a preacher story is, ask me later, okay? It's a bit of a worn-out anecdote, but it still has some power to make us think. So here it is. In his book, The Three Edwards, Thomas Costain tells about a duke in England who was a very fat man. And when his younger brother led a revolt and overthrew the duke, he built a prison room up around him where the doors were too small for the man to get out. And he told him, you can leave anytime you want. But then he continued to send him copious amounts of food every single day. And the Duke had not an ounce of self-control, and so he stayed in prison because of his own choices. That is exactly where we are with this concept in Proverbs 5. If we allow our sexual appetites to govern our choices, they keep us imprisoned in their death grip only because we have continually chosen to indulge them. Now, whether that's talking about fornication or pornography or adultery or sex before marriage or sex outside of marriage, we remain prisoners while the door has been left open for us to leave only because we have not had the self-control to get ourselves out. Now, while I'm on that topic, can I make just a bit of a sidestep and make a specific point that I think Christians need to hear? When men, especially those who are in prominent positions in the church or in some sort of Bible community like a college or a camp or something like that, when men in positions like that commit sexual immorality, it's really common for Christians to respond to news of that by saying something along the lines of, well, that just shows that it can happen to anybody. You should never say never. It could even happen to you. Can I just point out, with all the love in my heart, that that statement, as it stands, is not true. And the reason that it is not true and that we'd better stop saying it is because we might think we're saying no one's immune to temptation, and that much is true. 1 Corinthians would tell us that. But what we're actually saying, if we say it that way, is that sexual immorality just happens. There was no choosing. There was no thought. There was nothing to it. It just happened to someone. Can I just point out that as the Scriptures describe sexual choices, they are choices. And we need to understand that the difference there might sound like it's just semantics. But when we chalk up some Christians' adultery to, well, that can happen to anyone, number one, it takes away the responsibility of the choice that was made. And what God is telling us over and over and over again is, you make choices. Be self-controlled. Control those impulses the same way that you're told to control your impulses regarding anger and money and your appetite. You control your desires and make choices about your sexual behavior. And secondly, when we say it this way, when we say it like that, it communicates to everybody that you're not really in control in the first place, which makes a mockery of the Bible's warning to flee sexual immorality. In Genesis chapter 39, Joseph is being seduced by his master's wife. And Joseph could, because he had rule over everything in the house of his master, he was the chief slave in charge of everything. And the master trusted him so much so that Genesis says the master never even asked Joseph about what was in his house. Didn't even ask, didn't even want a report from this guy. He trusts him so much. And Joseph is being seduced by the man's wife. And number one, he says one of the most beautiful responses to temptation of all time. He says, how could I do this great evil and sin against God? And number two, when she presses him hard past that point, when temptation is forcing its way upon him, he embarrasses himself by leaving his robe in her hand and running out of the house naked. That's embarrassing. That's an embarrassing story to tell in front of a group of people, and I just did it, okay? But you know why that fascinates me and why that story matters? Because Joseph, if anybody ever had the opportunity to say, it just happened, that was the circumstance. And he wouldn't allow it. He went to some embarrassing lengths to make sure that that simply did not happen. And that's why it's really important that we don't speak language which implies I'm cavalier and it doesn't matter. This is Mufasa's wisdom from The Lion King, by the way. Being brave doesn't mean you go looking for trouble. I'm not asking for that. God's not asking us for that. But what he is asking us to do is to take ownership of this and not say that it can just happen to anyone. We're told to flee sexual immorality, and that might need to be taken very literally in some cases, but it's worth it. Because the Bible, and especially with a concentration here in Proverbs 5, is telling us over and over again, don't abdicate your responsibility. The mentality that says, oh, it can just happen to anybody, is a mentality that says, it doesn't matter if you resist temptation. It doesn't matter if you resist the devil. He won't flee from you. Yes, he will. And James told us so. And this is wisdom that everybody needs to take to heart. Again, what we think we're saying is that temptation comes for anybody and everybody, no matter what, how high you might climb in a Christian organization or whatever. That's what we think we're saying. And there is wisdom in that. Because I think sometimes we look at a passage like Proverbs 5, we hear those words read and we hear them explained and we think to ourselves, yeah, but that means someone else. That warning's for somebody else. Someone else needs to make sure that they don't go down that road. Well, you are someone else, and so am I. All of us need this warning. And that's the case with all biblical warnings. God knows us better than we know ourselves, and so his warnings are well-founded, which means, again, that every man, every woman who serves Christ should be self-controlled and resistant to the temptation to sexual immorality. Whether you make that application to the immorality of pornography, or to the flirting that's happening with a coworker, or to some kind of suggestive texting that may be going on, or to some sort of all-out affair that's already in progress, the warning of Proverbs 5 is still there. As one commentator named Derek Kidner put it in his commentary on the Proverbs, he said, this chapter helps us to recognize even marginal unchastity and unfaithfulness. And not only to recognize it, but to recognize it by its bad aftertaste to the conscience. That's helpful. And that's something that all of us need to understand. Sexual immorality is poison, and it kills, even if it kills slowly. And all of us need to be warned about its dangers. So the question is, what do we do about that? How do we actually take responsibility and make marriage something special that we are faithful to in order to please God by it? Well, that's the next section here. Verses 15 through 20 explain the way that godly sexuality should be manifest. And so let's take a read here, verses 15 through 20 of Proverbs chapter 5. He says, drink water from your own cistern, flowing water from your own well. Should your springs be scattered abroad, streams of water in the streets? Let them be for yourself alone and not for strangers with you. Let your fountain be blessed and rejoice with the wife of your youth, a lovely deer, a graceful doe. Let her breasts fill you at all times with delight. Be intoxicated always in her love. Why should you be intoxicated, my son, with a forbidden woman and embrace the bosom of an adulteress? You know what he's telling us there? He's telling us what modern scientific analysis will bear out easily, and that is that a healthy marriage is healthy for us. It's not just a good suggestion from God, like somebody might say it's a good idea to keep your shoes polished or something like that. It's not just a piece of advice. It's a command, and it's a command that has promise to it. I was listening to a podcast a handful of years ago from a researcher who spent a long time analyzing the trends and the subtleties, the nuances of men and marriage. And he said this in the podcast: when it comes to physical health, we know that married guys tend to do better on a whole bunch of outcomes. They tend to be less stressed, their immune systems tend to function better, and they tend to recover from things like cancer more quickly and more frequently. It looks like guys live about 9 years longer if they're stably married than their single or divorced peers. Bottom line, a healthy marriage is good for all of us. And that's why it has to be preserved and I think enjoyed and improved over the life of the marriage. And so let's just think about those three things real quick here. Number one, it's important for us as Christians to protect our marriages. That is seen in the language of the chapter here. Should your springs be scattered abroad, streams of water in the streets? No. Now, you might think that it's primarily the woman's responsibility to keep a man from wandering, but the principles of biblical masculinity put that on the shoulders of men. Now, it doesn't mean that the women are exempt from that responsibility, but it does mean that we have to be faithful as God has called us to. It's our responsibility to protect our marriage from things that threaten it. It's our responsibility, like God, who is a jealous husband to his bride, to be jealous in a righteous and good and gentle kind of way to our wives. She's yours, and she should know that that matters to you, brothers. And you should be concerned with your faithfulness to her. Means you should choose to shift your gaze somewhere else when another woman would draw your attention. Not because you don't want to get caught looking, but because your wives and your marriage, your wife and your marriage deserve to be protected. If a man feels that the best way to preserve the integrity of his marriage is to make himself accountable to another Christian for his behavior, then by all means let him do it. Because why should you be intoxicated, my son, with a forbidden woman and embrace the bosom of an adulteress? Secondly, a man should focus his efforts on improving the marriage, and so should the wife. I know that this might sound like advice from an afternoon talk show, but there is every biblical precedent for husbands and wives to give gifts to each other. Take that advice from God's own example, that as Christ loved the church and gave himself for her, so men ought to love their wives. Whether it's the gift of you doing household chores for each other, or planning a favorite activity and sharing it, or just whatever they love, jewelry, flowers, I don't know, sporting goods, like whatever it is, you know. Give gifts, build up the marriage, communicate, connect, listen well more than you talk. Do what you can to improve on the relationship that God has given you. And in doing all of that, enjoy your marriage as a gift from God. Solomon's words are poetic. Let your fountain be blessed, and rejoice in the wife of your youth, a lovely deer, a graceful doe. Let her breast fill you at all times with delight. Be intoxicated always in her love. You know, the reality is that God could have made marriage as just a friendship. It didn't have to include the sexual union and the pleasure that comes with that, but he did give it. And he talks about that as a gift to be enjoyed. He talks about that in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, making sure that married couples don't hold that back from one another, that we share in that, and that we enjoy it as a gift from God. He even uses language here about being intoxicated or swept away in each other's love. And I know that sounds like happily ever after Disney kind of stuff that could never happen, but it's in the scriptures revealed by God. It can happen. It can be the blessing that he says that it is, and so we should enjoy it. You've probably heard this at some point. I know I have, and I always love hearing when this happens. You ever heard an old man gush about how wonderful and beautiful his wife is after they've been together for like many decades? You ever heard him just talk about how special she is and how much she has improved his life and how much he admires and adores her? I remember hearing our brother D. Bowman do this one time, just in a conversation somewhere. He was just going on and on and on about how wonderful Miss Norma was. And I don't actually know Miss Norma that well, so I don't know if she deserves that or not. You know what I mean? But he went on and on and on about how wonderful she was. Now my question is, why is it that old men talk about old women like that? Why is it that when they've been together for so long, and I'm not being ugly, I'm just being honest, she's not as pretty as she was. She's not as energetic as she was. She's not able to share the excitements of life the same way that she once was. So when some things have been lost, why does it seem like there are some who still appreciate the incredible blessing that they still have? And I think the reason comes down to this. A cynic would tell us that familiarity breeds contempt. A faithful one would tell us that fidelity breeds delight. Brothers and sisters, if we do this God's way, if we rejoice in the wife of your youth, even when they're not young anymore, there's such a gift from God in the fact that He has given us to each other to share this life together. So, the last couple of verses here, the last 3 in the chapter, the question is, what's the reason for any of that? Why should we care about fidelity and infidelity? Well, there's plenty of reasons given further up the chapter, but this is how he concludes the whole thing. Verse 21, a man's ways are before the eyes of the Lord, and He ponders all his paths. The iniquities of the wicked ensnare him, and he is held fast in the cords of his sin. He dies for lack of discipline, and because of his great folly, he is led astray. Those phrases emphasize again the danger of straying from the path. And so the why turns out to be another warning. Why is it that we should avoid sexual immorality? It's for the good of our souls, both in this life, to avoid the heartaches of today, and in the eternal life, to avoid the heartaches that can last forever. All of those phrases in the final verses ring with the ideas that we associate with hell about a snare and being held fast. They make us think of Jesus' warning that those who enter into torment don't get out. And how do you get there? You get there when you're led astray. And that, by the way, makes me think of the parable of those who experienced the weeping and gnashing of teeth because they were choked out by the cares of this world. The whole thing comes down to whether we take God's warning seriously and whether we want the good life, both now and in the life to come, the life that is blessed by Him. It's really important, brothers and sisters, and I know you knew this coming in today, but I've got to remind all of us once in a while anyway. It's really important that we take responsibility for our fidelity to our marriages, because the stakes are high on every level. Is that sobering? I hope so. It is. It's meant to be. And so the question that I want us to end with is just to think about that. Am I willing to stand in the gap, to build the boundary walls, to protect marriage, to protect my marriage, and to take responsibility for my behaviors as God has called me to do? May God give us strength to protect what He has put in place. And that's the message for you this morning. I hope that it's helpful for us. If somebody among us has a spiritual need that you want to make known in a public kind of way, we always offer the opportunity to do that. You can come and talk to me about that, and I'll get my Bible, and we'll talk about what God says for you to do. Or you can talk to one of the elders of this congregation, and I can make the same promise on their behalf that they'll get their Bibles and show you what God says are the steps you can take to follow Him more faithfully. So if I can help you with that, or if they can, if you want to let us know in a public kind of way, why don't you come and talk to one of us while we're standing and singing this hymn together?